In the final years of the Second World War, as the vast distances of the Pacific shrank under the pressure of advancing Allied forces, a new sound began to dominate the skies over Japan. It was the deep, steady growl of an aircraft unlike any the Japanese military had faced before. This sound belonged to the American P-51 Mustang, a fighter plane whose arrival over the Japanese home islands would fundamentally alter the balance of air power and leave a lasting impression on both sides of the conflict. At the beginning of the war, Japan's air forces were built around agility, range, and pilot skill. Aircraft such as the Mitsubishi A6M0 had gained a fearsome reputation during the early campaigns in China and the Pacific. Light, highly maneuverable, and flown by experienced pilots, these fighters achieved stunning successes in 1941 and 1942. Japanese air doctrine emphasized dogfighting, close-in maneuver combat, and the belief that superior training and spirit could overcome material disadvantages. For a time, that belief seemed justified. The United States, however, approached air warfare differently. American industry focused on mass production, technological innovation, and long-term sustainability. As the war progressed, the U.S. Army Air Forces sought not only to defeat enemy aircraft, but to dominate entire airspaces, escort bombers deep into hostile territory, and deny the enemy any meaningful ability to respond. This strategic vision would eventually find its most effective expression in the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang did not begin as a legendary aircraft. Its early versions were fast and promising, but limited by their engines at high altitude. What transformed the P-51 into a dominant force was the pairing of its sleek airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built in the United States under license. This combination gave the aircraft exceptional speed, range, and high-altitude performance. It could fly farther than almost any other fighter of its time, climb efficiently, and maintain power at the altitudes where strategic bombers operated. By 1944, as American forces captured islands closer to Japan, the P-51 Mustang gained a new and critical role. It became the long-range escort for B-29 Superfortress bombers conducting raids against the Japanese home islands. For the first time, American bombers were no longer forced to fly unprotected for long stretches of their missions. The Mustangs could accompany them from takeoff to target and back again, challenging Japanese fighters at every stage of the journey. For Japanese pilots and air defense planners, this was a profound shock. Until then, interceptor tactics relied on the assumption that enemy fighters would have limited range. American fighters had previously been unable to escort bombers all the way to Japan, leaving windows of opportunity for interception. The arrival of the P-51 erased those windows. The sky was no longer something Japanese pilots could briefly contest and then reclaim. It became a hostile environment dominated by aircraft that were faster, heavily armed, and flown in large numbers. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese pilots began encountering Mustangs at altitudes and distances they had not expected. The P-51 was not only capable of engaging in dogfights, but could choose when and how to fight. Its speed allowed American pilots to dive into combat, strike, and disengage at will. Japanese fighters, many of which were lightly armored and underpowered by comparison, struggled to keep up or even escape once contact was made. Compounding this problem was the state of Japan's aviation industry by the later stages of the war. Material shortages, fuel scarcity, and sustained bombing campaigns had severely limited aircraft production and pilot training. New Japanese pilots often entered combat with far fewer hours of flight experience than their American counterparts. Against a machine like the P-51, flown by pilots trained under rigorous and standardized programs, this disparity became painfully clear.
The Mustang also carried a formidable armament. Equipped with 6 50-caliber machine guns, it could deliver devastating firepower in short bursts. For Japanese aircraft which prioritized maneuverability over protection, even brief exposure to this fire could be decisive. The knowledge that a single mistake could be fatal added to the growing sense of vulnerability among Japanese airmen. Beyond individual air battles, the broader strategic effect of Mustang dominance was even more significant. With air superiority increasingly in American hands, Japanese radar stations, airfields, and industrial targets became more exposed. P-51s were frequently used in fighter-bomber roles, attacking infrastructure and aircraft on the ground. This further reduced Japan's ability to mount an effective aerial defense and forced the diversion of scarce resources to airfield protection and repairs. Japanese military leadership recognized the threat but had few effective answers. Efforts were made to develop new interceptor aircraft capable of challenging the Mustang, but time and resources were against them. Experimental designs struggled to reach production, and even when new fighters entered service, they were often deployed in small numbers with insufficiently trained pilots. The rapid pace of American technological and numerical superiority outstripped Japan's ability to respond. As the air war intensified, encounters with P-51s became a source of dread. Japanese pilots reported seeing Mustangs appear seemingly from nowhere, their polished fuselages glinting in the sun, before diving with overwhelming speed. The sense that the enemy controlled not just the battlefield, but the very air above Japan contributed to a growing feeling of inevitability about the war's outcome. The Mustang's impact extended beyond combat statistics. It altered how the Japanese population experienced the war. The presence of American fighters over the home islands shattered the belief that Japan's geography provided natural protection. Civilians could hear and sometimes see these aircraft overhead, a reminder that the war had reached their doorstep and that the skies were no longer safe or familiar.
From the American perspective, the P-51 Mustang became a symbol of technological achievement and strategic foresight. It represented the successful integration of engineering, industrial capacity, and tactical doctrine. American pilots valued the aircraft for its reliability and performance, and many credited it with saving lives by keeping bombers protected and reducing losses. For Japanese forces, however, the Mustang came to symbolize a turning point they could not reverse. It embodied the growing gap between Japan's early war strengths and its late war realities. Where once skill and daring had carried the day, now they were overshadowed by machines that could outfly, outgun, and outlast anything Japan could field. The fear inspired by the P-51 Mustang was not simply fear of destruction, but fear of helplessness. It was the realization that traditional tactics no longer worked, that bravery alone could not overcome speed, altitude, and firepower. Each engagement reinforced the understanding that the balance of power had shifted decisively. By the final months of the war, American air dominance was nearly absolute. The P-51 Mustang continued to patrol Japanese skies, escort bombers, and strike targets with impunity. Japanese resistance, though still present, was increasingly fragmented and desperate. The aircraft that once symbolized hope and confidence for Japanese airmen were now outmatched relics of an earlier phase of the conflict. In retrospect, the terror inspired by the P-51 Mustang was rooted not only in its technical excellence, but in what it represented. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial and strategic system that Japan could not match. It showed how quickly warfare had evolved and how unforgiving that evolution could be. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang endures long after the war. It is remembered as one of the greatest fighter aircraft ever built, not because it was invincible, but because it arrived at the right moment with the right capabilities to change the course of the air war. For Japanese forces, its dominance over their skies marked the beginning of the end, a clear signal that control of the air and ultimately the war itself had slipped beyond their reach. In the quiet that followed the conflict, historians and veterans alike reflected on how the roar of the Mustang's engine came to define the closing chapter of the Pacific War. It was a sound that spoke of speed, reach, and overwhelming presence. For those who faced it from the ground or from the cockpit of an opposing aircraft, it was a sound that inspired fear, respect, and the painful recognition that the skies over Japan were no longer theirs. As the P-51 Mustang became a constant presence in the skies over Japan, its influence extended far beyond individual dogfights or bomber escort missions. It reshaped how Japanese commanders thought about defense, how pilots approached combat, and how an entire nation perceived the security of its homeland. The aircraft represented not just an enemy weapon, but a symbol of a war that had shifted decisively out of Japan's control. Japanese air defense doctrine had been built around interception from known directions and predictable enemy behavior. Early in the war, American aircraft lacked the range to sustain continuous pressure over Japan itself. This allowed Japanese forces to concentrate their defenses at key moments, preserving aircraft and fuel. The P-51 Mustang dismantled this logic. With its long range and endurance, it made American air presence persistent rather than episodic. Japanese planners could no longer predict when or where enemy fighters would appear. This uncertainty created constant strain. Airfields were forced into near-continuous readiness, exhausting personnel and draining fuel reserves. Aircraft were dispersed and hidden when possible, but Mustang-led strafing runs made even ground-based assets vulnerable. The psychological toll of knowing that American fighters could arrive at almost any moment was immense. Fatigue, anxiety, and declining morale spread among both pilots and ground crews. For Japanese pilots, the Mustang changed the nature of aerial combat. Earlier engagements often involved turning dogfights where skillful maneuvering could compensate for inferior equipment. Against the P-51, these tactics were increasingly ineffective. American pilots used altitude, speed, and coordinated formations to dictate the terms of engagement. They attacked from above, delivered decisive fire, and withdrew before Japanese fighters could respond effectively. This shift forced Japanese pilots into reactive roles. Instead of hunting bombers or choosing favorable engagements, they found themselves defending against fighters that outperformed them in nearly every category. Many Japanese aircraft struggled to climb quickly enough to reach the altitudes at which Mustangs operated. Even when contact was made, the engagement often ended before it truly began. The disparity in pilot training further widened the gap. American pilots arriving in the Pacific by late 1944 had benefited from extensive flight hours, standardized instruction, and combat experience gained over Europe or earlier Pacific campaigns. They flew Mustangs with confidence, trusting their aircraft's capabilities. Japanese pilots, especially newer ones, often had minimal training time due to fuel shortages and accelerated programs. Facing the P-51, they were not only outmatched technologically, but psychologically overwhelmed.
Fuel scarcity was another critical factor. The P-51 Mustang was efficient enough to operate across vast distances while still engaging in combat. Japan, by contrast, faced severe fuel shortages that limited both training and operational sorties. Pilots sometimes entered combat knowing they had only enough fuel for a single engagement. This knowledge added pressure and reduced tactical flexibility, making encounters with Mustangs even more dangerous. The American use of the P-51 also reflected a broader philosophy of air superiority. Mustangs were rarely sent alone. They operated in coordinated groups, maintained radio communication, and adapted tactics rapidly. Japanese forces, constrained by outdated communication systems and limited radar coverage, often struggled to organize effective responses. By the time interceptors were airborne, the Mustangs had already engaged or moved on to their next objective. The fear inspired by the Mustang was not irrational. It was grounded in repeated experience. Reports from Japanese units described the aircraft as fast, aggressive, and seemingly unstoppable. Pilots learned to recognize its distinctive silhouette and engine sound, and that recognition often triggered immediate alarm. The Mustang had earned its reputation through consistency. It did not rely on surprise alone. It dominated through reliability and presence. As American bombing campaigns intensified, the P-51's role became even more critical. It shielded B-29 formations during daylight raids and hunted Japanese interceptors before they could reach the bombers. This dual role, protector and hunter, made it especially feared. Japanese pilots were forced to contend with enemy fighters both on the approach and during withdrawal, leaving little room for recovery or regrouping. The impact on Japanese aircraft development was profound. Engineers attempted to design faster, more heavily armed fighters capable of countering the Mustang. Some designs showed promise on paper, but production delays, material shortages, and Allied bombing prevented them from being deployed effectively. Even when new aircraft reached operational units, they often lacked spare parts or trained pilots. In this environment, desperation began to influence decision-making. Japan increasingly relied on extreme measures to compensate for technological inferiority. While these actions reflected determination, they also underscored how thoroughly conventional air defense had been eroded by American air superiority. The P-51 Mustang played a central role in forcing Japan into this corner. For civilians, the presence of Mustangs overhead was a stark reminder of vulnerability. The idea that Japan was protected by distance and ocean had been deeply ingrained. The Mustang shattered that belief. Its long-range missions demonstrated that American power could reach anywhere, anytime. The sound of aircraft engines became associated not just with distant battlefields, but with immediate danger. American pilots, meanwhile, developed a deep respect for the Mustang. Many described it as an aircraft that inspired confidence. It forgave mistakes, responded predictably, and could endure damage while still bringing its pilot home. This trust allowed American pilots to focus on tactics rather than survival, further enhancing their effectiveness. The contrast between American abundance and Japanese scarcity became impossible to ignore. Mustangs were maintained, repaired, and replaced with efficiency. Losses were absorbed without halting operations. Japanese forces, by contrast, felt every loss acutely. Each destroyed aircraft and fallen pilot further weakened an already strained defense. As 1945 approached, the air war over Japan reached its climax. The P-51 Mustang was everywhere, over cities, industrial centers, transportation networks, and airfields. It operated with a freedom that would have seemed unthinkable earlier in the war. Japanese resistance, though still determined, lacked coordination and sustainability. By this stage, fear had evolved into resignation for many Japanese airmen. They continued to fly, continued to fight, but with the understanding that the odds were overwhelmingly against them. The Mustang was no longer just an adversary. It was a constant reminder of the war's irreversible trajectory. When the war finally ended, the legacy of the P-51 Mustang was firmly established. For the United States, it stood as a testament to engineering excellence and strategic vision. For Japan, it symbolized the moment when control of the skies was lost beyond recovery.
In post-war reflections, Japanese veterans often spoke of the Mustang with a mix of fear and respect. They recognized it as an aircraft that changed everything, not through brutality, but through dominance. It demonstrated that modern warfare favored those who could combine technology, training, and resources on an unprecedented scale. The story of the P-51 Mustang over Japan is ultimately a story about air power and its consequences. It shows how control of the skies can determine the fate of nations, how innovation can outpace tradition, and how fear can arise not just from destruction, but from the realization that resistance has become futile. Long after the engines fell silent, the memory of the Mustang's presence remained. It lingered in the accounts of pilots, the records of battles, and the understanding that the skies over Japan, once fiercely defended, had been irrevocably claimed by a new kind of warfare.